Hello, my name is Victoria Litman. I'm very honored, truly, to be here with this panel to speak to you all today about the religious use landscape for psychedelics. My presentation today is called Sincerity, Safety, and Legal Pathways. So this is what I'll be talking about today, a little bit about who I am, a little bit about where we are right now in terms of the legal landscape for the religious use of psychedelics. I'll talk about our options from my perspective, and then pose some questions for us to be thinking about when we're considering where it is that we want to go. Knowing, I thought Oriana made a great point on the last panel, who is we, what is the psychedelic community? Maybe we don't all share interests, right? But I'm speaking really generally, broadly, about people that are interested in the religious use of psychedelics. So who am I? I'm very personally invested in the religious use of psychedelics. Some of you met my husband yesterday. He's a Reform rabbi, so a Rebbitzin, very invested in my community, long-time relationship with psychedelics, and personally, communally, and also personally, spiritually meaningful to me. Professionally, I'm invested. This really niche intersection of religion, psychedelics, and law is my core area of expertise, along with cannabis and some other areas of drug law. But I would say I'm not financially invested, right? Different conferences handle conflicts differently, but I don't have any, when I'm telling you about these options and where I think we should go, I don't have any really money to be earned in this fight. I just care about this future. I've been thinking about this for a while. I won't name all the degrees, but I've studied religion, undergrad, grad level, law degree, tax law degree. I did research on tax approaches for psychedelic churches. I wrote my first paper about this a decade ago. So for me, that's a long time. That's a third of my life. I know, but for real, right? This is something I care a lot about, and some obviously affiliations, publications. I've published in law review articles and think tank pieces. I'm a visiting professor at Roger Williams University down the road in Rhode Island, where I teach tort law and psychedelics and cannabis. I'm very fortunate, and I see wonderful Glenn and Susanna in the audience. I'm a fellow in psychedelic law and spirituality at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics at Harvard Law School. Check them out if you haven't. So where are we, right? And this is my opinion, and this is a very big, large view. There is no clear legal pathway to widespread legal protection. We're going to talk a lot about DEA. We're going to talk about RFRA. We're going to talk about this DEA exemption process that was mentioned yesterday, right? But right now, that is not creating widespread legal protection for religious communities using psychedelics. The police oversee defining religious sincerity. Right now, the way it is, the DEA is in the position of granting religious exemptions from the Federal Controlled Substances Act, which requires proving to the DEA that you are a church in the eyes of the law, worthy of an exemption. For the record, they don't want the job. They haven't been doing it. They have never granted voluntarily an exemption. But right now, where are we? The police are in charge. This third one might be a little controversial. This is my opinion. The best case scenario under federal law sucks. My opinion, right? So we're talking about these DEA exemptions, where a church could litigate, they could fight for a DEA exemption, they can get one by court settlement. We saw that with Church of the Eagle and Condor. But even if they get this exemption, it is very strictly limited. It is one substance. There are strict requirements. So far, it has only applied to ayahuasca being imported internationally. It requires lawyers and resources to comply with this DEA exemption. In my opinion, it's not even what we should be striving for, but that's where we are. And finally, I think state law is promising. We have not really talked about state psychedelic law at this conference. I will point especially to Colorado. There's a personal use side of the Colorado Natural Medicine Health Act, which allows for remuneration for services that are alongside the sharing of 4 different psychedelic substances. And those services include both religious and non-religious services. So harm reduction services, support services, spiritual services, religious services. And if you look this up, you can actually find an article just from a few weeks ago about a church in Colorado Springs. It's actually very funny if you're in the drug world, where the church went to the state police and said, hey, is what we're doing okay? We're running this church out of our house. And the police said, yeah, you're good to go. This is legal under state law. We asked a few of your neighbors. One of them's kind of annoyed, but hey, what you're doing is legal and you are good to go, right? What's a DEA exemption? They're not even asking. They're focusing on what they can do that is legal under state law. And for the record, most drug crimes in this country are prosecuted under state law. Now, I know federal law matters, constitutional law professors, we're gonna get to it. So, what are our options? And this is a little oversimplified, but I think we can fight for more exemptions. We can try to change the exemption process, and we can question the exemption process. So a lot of what we're going to talk about later today is fighting for more exemptions. We're going to talk about what it looks like to litigate, what are these RFRA claims, how is the government defining religion, right? And I just want to say, because I am friends with lots of these speakers, and I think this is still worthwhile to talk about and consider. I'm not like totally throwing it away, but I don't think it should be the primary way that we're thinking about this issue. Again, we can try to change the exemption process. This is where I've spent most of my energy in my publications and my research, right? I've considered that we should come up with ways to shift the burden away from churches so they are no longer trying to prove their sincerity to the government. And so one of the ways that I've researched and proposed this, and again, I'm a tax law person, right, is to link DEA exemption with tax exemption. So the IRS right now is deciding religious sincerity in some cases. We could critique that process. We could say the IRS process should change, right? And in my work on this topic, I've also considered that maybe we should really follow how courts or how churches approach tax status, which is to say that churches are actually automatically considered tax exempt. So there is a tax code section, for all you nerds, 508C1 Cap A, which says that a church does not have to file for tax exempt status to be considered tax exempt. They are still subject to all of the same rules as other 501c3 churches. Very important. I see my lawyer friend saying, yes, you still have to follow the rules, right? But you don't have to prove your sincerity to the government to get that tax exemption. So maybe that should also apply to psychedelic churches. They could automatically be considered DEA exempt. And instead of the DEA sitting around and not deciding religious sincerity, it could actually do its job and implement regulations about safety. And it could go after churches that are not safely providing access to sacrament, and it would make it safer for people going to attend these services, because if something goes wrong, they can call 911. They can access other forms of civil recourse, right? I don't think psychedelics are inherently harmful, but we know that people get hurt during these ceremonies. Forms of abuse happen, people are too afraid to access emergency services, right? So I've talked about shifting the burden as a way to change the exemption process. And finally, we can question the exemption process, right? So, I mean, this is really, I've been sitting with this a lot, especially after this article from Colorado. It's like, does everyone need exemptions? I know federal law matters, right? But does anyone need exemptions? Right now, they've only been for ayahuasca. They've only dealt with importing, right? Your average church in Kentucky using psilocybin, do they really need to be like heavily regulated by the DEA? And this came up in Aize's presentation, right? What if you want to use more than one drug? Like, what if you don't want to be limited to what kind of drug you want to use and when you want to use it? And different drugs actually have different needs and safety profiles. So while strict DEA, and I'm not here to make this argument, I'm just saying it's possible that strict DEA regulation might be good for ayahuasca and unnecessary for psilocybin, right? And we need to, I think, be having these more nuanced conversations about who the exemptions are for and when we need them. So where do we want to go? These are some questions I'm asking, and this touches on my friend Jeff's presentation. How much do we want the law to shape the development of our religious practices? I think this is a big question we should be asking, right? On my notes, I have community greater than drugs, right? So if you know about the legal standard around religious sincerity, the idea here is typically the use must be central. And so what we're seeing around the substantial burden on the practice, and we can debate how different circuits see that, but a lot of churches are shaping their activity around this idea that their use of psychedelics must be central. And I think that's harmful, because the most important part to religious community is not drug use, it's community. So do we need to fight for reforms that only apply to religious activity? This is a big one that also gets to Aize's presentation. In Colorado, religious and non-religious activity is treated the same, right? We don't need to fight for these exemptions. And I'm questioning the whole model here. And I think also just to say that when the law does get in the business of deciding religion, who's that favoring? Majority religions, Christian religions, white religions, right? Religions that look a certain way in the eyes of the law, which I know my friends will talk about later. And finally, in my last minute, should we focus on state or federal-led drug law reform? So I get it. We have this idea that federal law is supreme. But in the drug world, as someone who teaches cannabis law, if most of you went and walked into a dispensary in the state, you're like, oh, this is legal. There's a legal industry here. There's legal businesses here. There is no official policy of federal non-enforcement right now. There is nothing stopping the federal government from going into these state legal cannabis businesses and raiding their goods. Like, what they're doing is federally illegal. Over time, we've had different versions of like a federal guidance memo. Those have been rescinded. We have a spending amendment, so actually there is something stopping the federal government from enforcing federal law against state medical marijuana programs. But on the adult use recreational side, we have nothing, right? So states have led the way on smart drug law reform, and I think we should be focusing our energy on the states. And with my last 30 seconds, I've been paying attention to the world, maybe a little too much, right? But federal government is shrinking. Right? The resources to invest in federal law is shrinking. And I think it's just this question of like, what does it mean to be legal and for who? Because for cannabis businesses, if we waited around until it was federally legal, we wouldn't have an industry. And I will leave it at that.